The Mughal Empire did not look like a dying empire when people first saw its power from a distance. It had cities crowded with merchants, court halls filled with silk and jewels, armies that could shake entire regions, and an emperor whose name still carried the weight of command. To foreign visitors, the empire seemed almost too rich to fail. Its rulers sat above one of the most productive agricultural worlds on earth, and its nobles moved through a culture of ceremony, poetry, architecture, and violence that could make decline difficult to recognize. But empires rarely fall at the moment when they look weakest. They often begin to break when they still look magnificent. By the early 18th century, the Mughal throne still shone, but the power beneath it had begun to change shape. Orders still left the imperial court, but fewer people feared them. Taxes were still demanded, but collecting them had become harder. Generals still claimed loyalty, but their loyalty had a price. Provincial governors still used the emperor's name, but many had already learned to rule without him. The collapse of Mughal power was not one disaster, one bad emperor, one battle, or one invasion. It was a long narrowing of choices. The empire had been built through conquest, compromise, revenue, military service, and the careful management of difference. It ruled over peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped in different ways, traded through different networks, and remembered authority through different local traditions. For a long time, that complexity was not a weakness. It was the source of Mughal strength. The emperors did not need every subject to love them, but they needed enough elites, soldiers, landholders, clerks, merchants, and religious authorities to accept that imperial rule was useful. When that bargain worked, the empire could absorb rebellion, reward ambition, and turn former enemies into servants of the throne. When that bargain failed, the empire still had palaces, titles, ceremonies, and memories, but it no longer had the same command over reality. The story of the Mughal decline begins with a dangerous illusion. The empire still possessed the language of supreme power after the mechanisms of power had started to decay. That made the fall slower, stranger, and in some ways more tragic. It allowed emperors, nobles, rebels, and foreign companies to act as if the old world still existed while everyone was quietly learning how to survive without it. The question is not simply why the Mughal Empire fell. The harder question is why it remained visible for so long after its authority had already been broken. At its height, Mughal power was not just a crown sitting in Delhi or Agra. It was a machine that connected the court to the countryside, the army to the tax system, and ambition to imperial service. The emperor rewarded nobles with the right to collect revenue from assigned lands while expecting those nobles to maintain troops and serve the state. This was not a simple feudal order, and it was not a modern bureaucracy. It was something more flexible and more fragile. The empire depended on movement. Nobles were transferred, offices were reassigned, revenue rights were redistributed, and military service was tied to rank, honor, and survival. A man could rise high if the court trusted him, but that same rise tied his fortune to the imperial system. This arrangement allowed the Mughals to draw warriors, administrators, Persians, Central Asians, Indian Muslims, Rajputs, Marathas, and other local powers into one imperial world. The empire did not erase difference. It managed difference by turning powerful men into stakeholders. That was one of the reasons the Mughal state became so formidable. It did not need to rule every village directly. It needed to make sure that enough people with local influence found it profitable to rule in the emperor's name. The system worked brilliantly when conquest brought new resources, when revenue expanded, when offices could be distributed, and when imperial prestige remained convincing. But the same system created pressure as soon as expansion slowed. The number of nobles who expected reward kept growing. The amount of reliable revenue did not grow in the same way. Many assignments looked valuable on paper, but produced less in reality. Officials squeezed the countryside harder, local intermediaries resisted more fiercely, and the distance between courtly accounting and rural life widened. This was one of the quiet fractures of Mughal decline. It did not announce itself with a single rebellion. It appeared in arrears, disputes, delayed payments, unpaid soldiers, and nobles who treated their assignments as opportunities for extraction rather than long-term rule. The empire had always contained violence, but now violence increasingly came from within the imperial order itself. A governor sent to collect revenue might behave like a conqueror. A military commander who was supposed to defend imperial authority might build his own regional base. A local chief who had once negotiated with the court might decide that the court no longer had enough force to punish him. This was how imperial decline often worked. It was not the disappearance of government. It was the privatization of power by men who still used the emperor's titles. The court could still name officials, but naming a man was not the same as controlling him. The emperor could still issue decrees, but a decree had to travel through roads, treasuries, soldiers, scribes, landlords, and interests before it became reality. Every weak link gave someone a chance to reinterpret obedience. For an English-speaking audience used to the fall of Rome or the unraveling of other empires, the Mughal case can feel familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. There was no single barbarian wave that erased the state. There was instead a long struggle over who had the right to collect, command, and define authority. The empire did not vanish because people forgot its name. It weakened because too many people discovered that the name could be used without obeying the center behind it. That discovery was fatal. No figure is more closely tied to the debate over Mughal decline than Aurangzeb. Later memory often turned him into either the emperor who destroyed the empire or the last ruler strong enough to hold it together. Both versions are too simple. Aurangzeb inherited an empire of enormous wealth and ambition, but he also inherited a political world in which expansion had become almost addictive. The Mughal state had grown through conquest and incorporation. To stop expanding was not merely to stop fighting. It was to stop feeding the expectations of a ruling class built around rank, service, and reward. Aurangzeb spent much of his reign in the Deccan fighting long campaigns that stretched the empire's military and financial systems. The Deccan was not an empty frontier waiting to be absorbed. It was a complex political landscape of sultanates, warrior houses, forts, mobile armies, local loyalties, and shifting alliances. The emperor could win battles there and still fail to settle the region. He could take a fort and discover that the war had simply moved somewhere else. He could defeat one enemy and create the conditions for another to rise. The Marathas became the most important example of this problem. They were not just a rebel force that could be crushed by one imperial victory. They used mobility, local knowledge, fort networks, and political flexibility to make Mughal success expensive and temporary. The longer the emperor fought, the more the empire was forced to spend men, money, and attention far from its northern heartlands. Aurangzeb did not fall all at once. His victories accumulated into a problem. The empire grew wider, but its grip grew thinner. An emperor who believed in discipline, order, and conquest found himself ruling an expanding field of unresolved obligations. The court followed him south, and the imperial center became physically and politically stretched. Meanwhile, the question of religion hardened his reputation in later history. Aurangzeb's policies towards some Hindu institutions, the reimposition of the jizya tax, and conflicts with Rajputs and other groups became part of a powerful story about intolerance and decline. That story contains real evidence, but it can also become too neat. The Mughal Empire had always involved negotiation with non-Muslim elites, and even under Aurangzeb, many Hindu officials served in high positions. The issue was not simply belief. It was the way political trust, revenue, pressure, war, and imperial ideology interacted. When an empire is strong, harsh policies may be absorbed or negotiated. When an empire is under stress, the same policies can deepen suspicion and turn disagreement into resistance. Aurangzeb's reign exposed the limits of Mughal expansion. He did not create every problem, but he pushed the imperial machine to its breaking point. By the time he died in 1707, the empire was still vast. That was exactly the danger. It looked enormous on a map, but its size now concealed exhaustion. The emperor had outlived many of his enemies, yet he had not solved the question that mattered most. How could the empire govern what it had conquered? After his death, that question became impossible to avoid. The throne he left behind was still prestigious, but prestige could not pay soldiers, calm provinces, or stop ambitious men from measuring the weakness of the center. Aurangzeb's long war did not destroy the Mughal Empire in a single blow. It left behind an empire that still existed but had become far more expensive to hold than to claim. After Aurangzeb, the Mughal succession exposed another weakness that had always lived close to the throne. The empire had no peaceful automatic method for transferring supreme power. Princes fought, nobles chose sides, armies moved, and victory decided legitimacy. This had happened before, and strong winners had survived it. But after 1707, each struggle cut deeper because the political system had less spare strength to absorb the damage. The emperor was still the source of honor, appointment, and symbolic legitimacy that made him important. It also made him vulnerable. If a noble or faction could control the emperor, it could control the language of legality. The throne began to change from a seat of command into a prize that others fought to possess. This was one of the most humiliating transformations of Mughal decline. The emperor remained sacred in ceremony, but in practice he could become dependent on kingmakers, ministers, guards, and provincial strongmen. The court became a place where old grandeur and new weakness existed side by side. There were still processions, robes of honor, formal audiences, and imperial titles. But behind the performance, power had become unstable and increasingly negotiable. The Sayyid brothers, powerful kingmakers in the early 18th century, showed how far the balance had shifted. They raised emperors, removed emperors, and treated the imperial household as a battlefield of factional control. Their rise did not mean the Mughal name had lost value. It meant the name was valuable enough to be captured. At the same time, provincial governors began turning imperial offices into hereditary or semi-independent regional powers. Bengal, Awadh, Hyderabad, and other regions still acknowledged the emperor in form, but their rulers increasingly controlled their own revenue, armies, and diplomacy. They did not always need to declare independence. Open rebellion could be dangerous and unnecessary. It was often better to honor the emperor from a distance while keeping the money at home. This created a strange political map. The Mughal Empire survived as a framework of legitimacy, but real authority moved outward. The center became poorer while the provinces became more self-directed. The empire was not replaced by chaos alone. It was replaced by regional states that used Mughal habits, Mughal titles, Mughal administrative practices, and Mughal court culture while no longer obeying the imperial center in the old way. That is why the decline can be misleading. If we look only for disappearance, we miss transformation. Mughal power did not simply evaporate. It was inherited, borrowed, imitated, and broken apart by successor regimes. Delhi still mattered, but it mattered differently. To control the emperor was to claim a connection to the old order. To ignore him entirely was still difficult because the old order had shaped the political imagination of the subcontinent. This gave the Mughal dynasty a strange afterlife while it was still alive. Its prestige outlasted its command. Its style outlasted its strength. Its emperor outlasted his empire. The weakening of the Mughal center invited a harsher kind of test. When authority becomes uncertain, outsiders do not always need to destroy it. Sometimes they only need to reveal what has already broken. In 1739, Nader Shah of Iran invaded northern India and entered Delhi. The shock was not only military, it was psychological. Delhi was not just another city. It was a symbol of imperial order, courtly memory, and Mughal supremacy. When Nader Shah's forces seized the city and carried away enormous treasure, including objects associated with the highest Mughal grandeur, the world understood something that ceremonies could no longer hide. The emperor could be humiliated in his own capital. The old fear was gone. The sack of Delhi did not by itself cause the decline. It exposed it with unbearable clarity. After Nader Shah came further invasions and pressures from the northwest, including the campaigns of Ahmad Shah Durrani. North India became a zone where Afghans, Marathas, regional rulers, Sikhs, Rohillas, Jats, and others contested power in overlapping ways. The Mughal emperor was still invoked, but increasingly as a symbol in someone else's political game. The Marathas, once the great pressure on Aurangzeb's Deccan campaigns, expanded northward and became major players in the struggle for imperial inheritance. Their rise showed how completely the balance had changed. A force that had once resisted Mughal incorporation could now appear as a protector, manipulator, or claimant within the old imperial order. Then came another kind of power, one that looked different from the horsemen and court factions of the old world. European trading companies had been present in the Indian Ocean world for generations, but the English East India Company gradually became something more dangerous than a commercial guest. It learned how to use trade, debt, diplomacy, military force, and Indian political rivalries to expand its authority. The company did not conquer the Mughal Empire in one clean campaign. It entered a landscape already fragmented by regional ambition and imperial weakness. In Bengal, the wealthiest provinces of the Mughal world became central to the company's rise. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 was small compared with many imperial battles, but its consequences were enormous. It revealed how a European company could exploit court politics, financial interests, and military uncertainty to gain decisive influence. In 1765, when the company received the Diwani, the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, the transformation became even clearer. The company gained access to the fiscal foundation of power, while still operating through forms of Mughal legitimacy. This was not simply foreign conquest replacing Indian rule overnight. It was a disturbing hybrid moment. A trading corporation used the emperor's authority to collect revenue from some of the richest lands in Asia. The Mughal name had become a legal instrument in the hands of men who did not serve the Mughal state. That may be one of the sharpest symbols of the decline. The empire's own language of authority survived, but it could now authorize the rise of a power that would eventually make the emperor politically irrelevant. By the late 18th century, the center was no longer merely weak. It was surrounded by powers that understood how to use its weakness. The Mughal emperor still existed because his name was useful. That usefulness was also his prison. The Mughal Empire officially ended in the 19th century, but its political death had taken much longer than its legal death. By the time Bahadur Shah Zafar became the last Mughal emperor, the throne had become almost entirely symbolic. He was a poet, a cultural figure, and a fragile link to a vanished order more than a sovereign ruler in the old sense. Delhi still carried memory, but memory was not command. The British East India Company, and later the British Crown, increasingly controlled the structures that mattered. Revenue, military force, diplomacy, and administration had moved elsewhere. Yet the Mughal name did not disappear from imagination. That is why the uprising of 1857 placed Bahadur Shah Zafar at its symbolic center. Rebels who came from different backgrounds could rally around him, not because he possessed real imperial power, but because the Mughal throne still represented a lost legitimacy greater than any one faction. In that moment, the ghost of empire became politically useful one last time. The British understood the danger of that symbol. After the rebellion was defeated, Bahadur Shah Zafar was tried, exiled to Rangoon, and the Mughal dynasty was formally ended. The last emperor died far from Delhi, separated from the city that had made his name meaningful. It was a quiet ending to a dynasty once associated with some of the richest courts in the world. But even that ending can mislead us if we imagine decline as a straight line from greatness to ruin. The Mughal world did not simply vanish. Its administrative habits shaped successor states. Its artistic language influenced architecture, painting, textiles, gardens, and courtly taste. Its Persianate culture interacted with regional languages and helped form literary worlds that outlived imperial rule. Its memory became a battlefield for later politics, colonial histories, nationalist arguments, religious debates, and popular imagination. Some remembered the Mughals as foreign conquerors. Others remembered them as builders of a composite civilization. Some blamed Aurangzeb for everything. Others blamed economic strain, military overextension, regionalization, European capitalism, or the failure of imperial institutions to adapt. The truth is less comfortable than a single villain. The Mughal Empire declined because its system became too strained to manage the forces it had once organized. Its military expansion created obligations it could not easily sustain. Its revenue order placed pressure on the countryside and on the officials who depended on it. Its court politics turned emperors into prizes. Its provinces became strong enough to survive without the center. Its enemies learned how to use its prestige against it. Foreign companies entered not as unstoppable destiny, but as opportunists in a world already cracked open. The empire did not collapse in a single night. It became less able to turn obedience into action. It became less able to make fear, reward, and legitimacy move in the same direction. And once that happened, the throne could glitter without ruling. That is the tragedy of the Mughal decline. It was not the disappearance of splendor. It was the separation of splendor from power. By the end, the empire still had a name that could move armies, inspire rebels, frighten colonizers, and haunt historians. But the emperor no longer controlled what that name meant. His enemies, successors, servants, rebels, and conquerors all claimed pieces of the Mughal inheritance. History did not remember the empire as it saw itself. It remembered a magnificent court, a fractured state, a long war, a stolen treasury, a symbolic emperor, and a fall that took more than a century to finish. That is why the Mughal decline still matters. It shows that empires do not only die when their palaces burn. Sometimes they die while the lamps are still lit, while the court still gathers, while the titles are still spoken, and while everyone continues pretending that the old words still mean what they once meant.